Hey everybody, this is Garrett with Earth and Time, and today we're going to go explore a really unique place. We're actually going to be able to walk across a portion of the Pacific Coast Highway about 30 to 45 minutes south of San Francisco, just south of the town of Pacifica. And what's amazing about this area is this is somewhere where what's happening with the Earth's history has directly influenced human history, and that is we're going to go investigate and check out what's known as the Devil's Slide and the geology there, a section of Pacific Coast Highway that was open for almost 100 years, about 80 years plus, that actually had to be shut down, and they ended up having to tunnel through a mountain because they had to shut that section of Pacific Coast Highway down so often due to geologic hazards. So come join me today. Let's go check out Devil's Slide. Let's get to it. Drove through the tunnel where they had to create the new Highway 1 due to Devil's Slide, and now we're at the Devil's Slide parking lot, which I'll say there's not very many spots there. I got really lucky and got a spot. You'll see it's really a busy and popular hike, especially on a weekend. But what I want to do is turn this around and show you some of the amazing scenery and talk a little bit about the geology. In fact, you can see these cliffs down here. A number of these cliffs look like they're a combination of both some kind of granite as well as maybe some old sandstone. But what's important for thinking about slides and coastal erosion processes for California is you can see the fractures, especially as I zoom in. You can see these fractures here, and as time goes on, these whole cliff faces are going to start falling off into the ocean, which creates the slides. Now, the other really interesting thing to see here is off in the distance over here, there's a World War II bunker that was put in place that would have, this was a place where they can keep an eye on the oceans to make sure none of the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, Italy, were going to try to come across here and try to attack California. And so that's pretty cool that there's a remnant of that lookout. Now, what I don't know, if all that erosion underneath it is post World War II and all natural, or if people actually carved it down so people wouldn't climb into it. That I don't know. But if there's been that much erosion, that's pretty significant, because there's people over there, and that's got to be somewhere around 10 to 12 feet of erosion since World War II on this cliff face, which just gives you an idea, if that is the case, how quickly these cliffs are eroding and why you have the big landslides that are coming off of here, slumping into the ocean. So welcome to the abandoned portion, Pacific Coast Highway. This was the road people used to drive on. So I'm actually walking on the Pacific Coast Highway, which is really cool to know. This is where cars have been coming for well over 100 years, and the tunnel system up around a decade ago. So that means this was the main thoroughfare for the Pacific Coast Highway up until that point. It's really neat that we can actually walk on this stretch today. Because there's rocks, I have to get up close and personal. Now, I can tell you right away that this is some kind of granite, and I can tell because the quartz crystals here, it's really beaten up. Actually, this is probably more of a gneiss at this point. It's been slightly metamorphically altered, but what's hanging out in here is a lot of the big chunks of quartz, which gives it this appearance. This is probably maybe a diorite or a granodiorite. And what is super cool about this is that this stuff came all the way from the Mojave Desert in Southern California down just east of Los Angeles. So these rocks have traveled a very, very long way over millions of years. So right now we're still on the Pacific Plate, and this piece of the Pacific Plate came all the way from basically the Mojave Desert area of Southern California. And these rocks, you can find their sister rocks down there today, but now we're hundreds of miles away. Pretty cool to think about and really neat to see. What a story and what an adventure rocks have been on. Okay folks, I just got squirreled. Check this tree out. It's got roots growing down through the rocks. Now, if you all saw my video from Southern California where I went to the San Gabriel Mountains, I actually talked about this phenomena where the trees find fractures for the roots to run through, because that's where water is going to run through, right? It's a zone of weakness in the rocks, and it's going to filter the water there. So trees take advantage of that, and you can see that this tree is pretty darn healthy because it's taking advantage of the fractures here to get the water. You can imagine driving here, you're top down, cruising between these little hilltops, and getting the stunning view. Now, the downside is you can see all this granodiorite on the right-hand side and how fractured and beaten up it is. See all these lines and lineations going through it. These are all ready for disaster in the sense of rock falls. Now, for us walking, we can get out of the way, but if you can imagine a vehicle running through here, it could be a real issue. You can see why they ended up having to close off this section of the road. Like, look at this fault zone running right through there. And you can see where water's accentuated it. And you can see it going all the way up and up and up, all the way up. Indeed, we went across our fault zone where we were in our granodiorite, and now we're into whatever this craziness is here. And I'm not even sure what this is, folks. So I have to get up close. It looks like, well, maybe this is still some kind of granodiorite, but it's really beaten up and discolored, suggesting there's maybe some fluid flow that went through it. See how it's kind of that greenish color? And then there's some pinks in here. And look at this faulted mess. Can everybody see this? Look between these two zones. You can see when everything's been smushed along this fault zone, running right up. And as I continue along here, it's no wonder this was such an engineering nightmare and why they had to, do that great engineering feat of putting a tunnel through this whole cliff. Because, as we can see off in the distance, all this stuff is primed just to slide right down because it's on this very broken, fractured material. And this fractured, broken material just needs a little bit of water, a little bit of time, and you're going to have some major landslides. All right, so we've entered the Devil's Slide section as I turn that last corner, and I got to tell you, I think I'd have been a little worried about driving down this on a regular basis as well. And check out that change. So here's our beaten up granodiorites, and then notice the change going across. You can actually see some bedded stratigraphy up there, or rocks, and that tells me there's definitely a change or a fault zone between here and there, and those are probably more sedimentary. All the debris draping over those other rock outcrops. So you can just get an idea about how, with just a little bit of water on these unstable slopes that are very steep, all this would just come crashing down and it would just knock out this road again and again. Now I turned around in the middle of this section, so I want to point out the trees and the tower up there. So that tower was a watchtower. In fact, there's a bunker down here where there were individuals, like the bunker we saw earlier, who would communicate back to large guns that were stationed along the Pacific coast here, and they would relay saying, hey, we see enemy ships, here's their coordinates. Now, those lookout stations basically became obsolete right around 1950 because of aircraft. Aircraft could travel farther, ships couldn't get within range without aircraft finding out and being able to attack them. Now back to the rocks. So as I walk up and look at the stratigraphy here, this looks different than what we were seeing before. And so these look like they're actually a series of sandstones and mudstones, so ancient seabeds. And all these ancient seabeds, you can see here, all these muds, what's interesting about those is that they're very easily eroded, and if they get a little bit wet, they start moving. And so if there's anything heavy or heavier units on top of them, when it gets wet, this whole thing slumps down, takes out the road, and drives it right into the sea. And I guess the name comes from Devil's Slide because it's taking you right on down the slope. Actually, this is a fantastic example of why this is a major risk. This is all water leaching out from underneath these beds. And so that water is coming down, it's coming down, hits some impermeable layer, and then eventually leaks out. But what that does is creates a zone of weakness in this cliff face. And you can see where the resistant rock has less resistant rock, this muddier rock above it. And eventually that all just will continue to slide down and down and down. And we all know the stories now that there's a lot of coastal erosion happening here in California, and landslides are a regular occurrence, really a yearly occurrence here now along the coast of California. And here's a nice look at some of those muddy beds, probably from what I read from just after the time of the dinosaurs. These were all deposited in a deep ocean setting, and that's why they're so fine and dark. Basically a mudstone that would have been deposited somewhere of the equivalent of way out there in the deeper part of the ocean, but they've been brought up due to all the faulting here. And it's worth mentioning, where you see the bare rock, this other stuff's right on top of it, probably sloughed down over this material, and all ends up falling and failing together down the slope. This is another great spot where you can see what looks like maybe old turbidite deposits. So these are sandstones that got deep out in the ocean, but then they're covered by these large beds of mudstones with a little bit of siltstone probably in there, which are the little resistive kind of tan color features you see in there. So these would all been deep water deposits. And again, this just is basically, think of it as like mud that's been lithified. So ancient mud. So when you add water to mud, what happens? Things start to fail. And in fact, you can see over here where the engineers have actually put a cover to try to protect the rocks from falling down on us today, even as we walk here. A really cool view of what deep ocean looks like in stratigraphy that's now exposed. Also along the way, they have all these markers talking about what kind of animals live out here. You'll see, even a great white shark, elephant seals, sea lions, dolphins, harbor seals, and what's interesting is it talks about the Farallon Islands, which way out there somewhere, which we can't see today, but what's fascinating about those, they said somewhere way out here, is that actually marks the low point of the ocean before the glacier started melting. So in other words, all the way in front of me out to the Farallon Islands, tens of miles out there, was all land when the last glacial ice age was at its maxima. Pretty crazy to think about that people would have been living out here and walking out here, the ancient indigenous people, and now it's all under the oceans because of all the ice melting. Absolutely fascinating. Engineers have used chain mail and chain link to protect the trail here, where you can see these large slabs are breaking off, getting a little bit of water in them, and they just tumble down here onto the old Pacific Coast Highway. They have information actually about Devil's Slide, which we're standing somewhere right in here right now. And you can see that is what's behind me here, where they've stabilized this. So it says the slide is about half a mile wide and extends 900 feet from the ridge top to the ocean. Millions of years of upward pressure has broken and weakened the rock of these cliffs. Since 1937, when this section of the highway opened, it's been closed dozens of times due to rock falls and the rock movement. One last thing I want to point out on this board here is where it talks about the granitic rock, which we talked about when we first got here, the sedimentary rock, which we've been looking at, and then there's this thing called the Franciscan complex, which is what we saw on top of the quarry material when we were there. And so you can get an idea that the most dangerous part of this feature is, of course, right here at the sedimentary rock and where this boundary is between the sedimentary rock and the granitic rock. Nice little simplified diagram. Now, what also is cool about this is, if you watch my other videos, I talk about the three rock types, right? There's three rock types or rock families. There's sedimentary, which we see here. There's igneous, which are the granodiorites and granitic rocks. And then there are metamorphics, which is actually your Franciscan complex. So really cool, you have all within a stretch here, all three rock types and rock families, which is pretty unique to have that close together. Of course, the reason they're all close together is a much more complex story, and one we'll save for another day. One other thing I'll point out while we're standing here is you can actually see these rocks sticking out, and what you'll notice is rocks, when they're deposited, are usually deposited flat, and these are all up on end, and that trend continues into the hillside way over here where we can actually see some of them are folded, telling me again there's a fault zone that's running through this area. And looking at the difference in rocks from there over to here tells me that there must be a fault likely running right through that region. I'll say I'm not an engineer, but I'm always fascinated by how humans have to interact with their environment and how engineers need to find creative ways to try to keep things like landslides and rock falls happening. In this case, the earth eventually won. In fact, as I walk down a little farther, you can see how this is all flat. It looks like they tried to stabilize this part by basically using concrete or cement, but it didn't work either. And they even tried to put a pipe out to try to drain the water from on top of the mountain up here. And you'll see the little pipes coming down still, where they're trying to drain as much water out of the soil here and truck it right down into the Pacific. But again, none of those seem to work. And that's why we have this wonderful hiking trail where you can walk a portion of the historic Pacific Coast Highway. All right, thank you all for joining me today to check out this amazing geologic feature, learning the story about how that granite also moved all the way up from Southern California to Northern California along the San Andreas Fault zone, checking out how the engineers actually tried to stabilize the slopes through the years, but ultimately Earth always won out. And last, it was really neat seeing some of the World War II history here as well. I didn't expect that, and that was a surprise for me. So if you enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. I love having you all join me and learn right along with me. Often when I visit these sites, it's my first time at these sites as well, so I'm making observations real time with you all and trying to figure out the geologic or the history of the area. So with that being said, thanks again. We'll catch you all in the next adventure. Take care.